when we try and understand the way that the macroeconomy works within a country, one of the main aspects that we need to think about is the level of demand that is taking place within that economy. And to do that, we need to use this concept of aggregate demand. Now, depending on the way that you're doing your course, you may well have come across demand in microeconomics, but it's really important in macroeconomics to remember the distinction which comes from this word at the front, the aggregate demand, because this is how we use this to talk about the total level of demand across the whole economy. So in microeconomics, demand means how much demand there is for an individual product at a particular price. Aggregate demand is talking about the whole economy, and it's talking about the total demand for domestically produced goods and services. So when we are talking about the macroeconomy, we need to talk about aggregate demand rather than individual product demand. Aggregate demand meaning the total demand total demand for domestically produced goods and services within a particular time period. So if we're talking about total demand for domestically produced goods and services, what we need to think about really is where that demand will be coming from. This total, how will it actually be made up? So what we can do here, if we just scroll this down a little bit, if we think about the total level of demand within the economy, so if we think about the level of aggregate demand within an economy, it's often abbreviated down to AD. Which groups within our economy might be demanding for domestically produced goods and services? Well, the first one that probably springs to mind, because it's the one that we individually have most experience of, are households. So individual households will obviously demand domestically produced goods and services. So when you book a stay in a hotel in the UK, then you are generating some demand for a domestically produced service in that case. When you go into Tesco's and you buy strawberries or something like that, if they were grown in the UK, then you are demanding a domestically produced good. So households have a key role in terms of contributing to this total demand. And to talk about households, we refer to what they do as consumption. So households, when they demand goods and services that are produced within that economy, then that we talk about that as being consumption. So who else is going to demand domestically produced goods and services? Well, another economic actor which might well demand domestically produced goods and services is a firm. Now this one's perhaps a little bit less obvious, but obviously if a firm was deciding to construct a building, or it was deciding to buy some new machinery or something like that, it may well be calling on domestic economic resources to be able to do that. Now when a firm does those sorts of things, we refer to that as investment. We'll go through that in a little bit more detail in due course, but investment in the economic sense of the word means when an economic entity, normally a firm, although as we see it doesn't necessarily have to be, creates fixed capital. So that might be something like a building, it might be something like machinery, it might be something like an IT infrastructure. Those sorts of things, they are deemed as being investment. And if the firm calls upon domestic resources to do those things, then they contribute also to this aggregate demand. Now, another economic actor that has a role to play here is the government, because the government also buys a lot of things. It has quite a substantial amount of procurement, so the government can also be involved in generating some of this total demand. Now, some of what they do, as we said before, it's not always firms. Some of what the government does may be considered investment. If the government decides to, for instance, at the moment they're building Crossrail, they are and on the point, hopefully, of making a decision finally on the airport capacity in the southeast of the UK. So when they make a decision like that, then that is investment. But then we also have the more kind of day-to-day stuff. So government expenditure is the more kind of day-to-day government purchases. So, this would be, kind of buying in the materials and so on, which allow the government to function. So if we're thinking about the NHS, the government buying in the medications and so on to enable the doctors to treat patients, that would be considered government expenditure. And obviously, if those medications were produced in the UK, then that would also contribute to this total level of demand. The final section that we need to think about is what's going on outside the UK. So all of these three that we've looked at so far, so the households, the firms and the governments, all of these have been domestic households, domestic firms and domestic government, i.e. consumers within the UK, firms within the UK and the British government and so on. But obviously there is also the likelihood that there will be some involvement from the foreign sector, because obviously there are people abroad who are going to buy British products, and when someone abroad buys a British product, then we are considered to have exported our products to them, and that export contributes to aggregate demand. But we also have to remember that it may well be the case that we're importing as well, and we will have to deduct those, so they will become a negative in terms of the total level of demand, because that's when British households are buying something, but the thing that they're buying has been made somewhere else. So what we have then is aggregate demand, which, as we can see here, is made up of various components. So let's just summarise those on the next. So when we think about aggregate demand, we should always think about it in terms of the individual components. So the individual components are the consumption that comes from the households, the investment which comes from firms and governments, the government expenditure, that's the day-to-day stuff that the government spends money on, and then we also have to consider what we call the net trade position. And what we do there is we take the amount of exports, which we abbreviate with X, and we deduct the amount of imports that we designate with an M. So what that gives us then is a really important way of structuring our thinking when it comes to aggregate demand within the economy, which is that aggregate demand is equal to these four components added together. So consumption, which is done by the households, investment, which is done by firms but could also be done by government, government expenditure, which is, if we remember, their day-to-day stuff, and then the net trade position. And when you add all of those up, you have the total amount of demand for domestically produced goods and services, which we refer to as aggregate demand.